So JG, your creative prowess is just unbelievable with this last sticky note, the economic hodgepodge stew. This is all a bunch of parts and pieces of what we need to look at as real estate investors economically, and there's all bits and pieces of it. The point of it is that we have to look at this as investors, not as a home buyer, not as those individuals that are just doing their thing, looking to buy their next house or their first home. Here's what we have to consider in all of this, JG. Economically, things are slowing down. It's confusing, it's uncertain, and people are sitting on the sidelines. They don't know what to do next. When we change the way we look at things, the things we look at can change. And as real estate investors, in amongst all of this chaos and uncertainty is opportunities. And let's go back to one fundamental, which we'll talk about, which is rental demand is going to continue to increase just from immigration alone, let alone affordability. So we can talk about that later or just in this segment, but there's lots of bits and pieces that normal public doesn't look at these things. Investors look at these things. That's what sets us apart as sophisticated.
The hodgepodge stew is just like a stew. That's why we called it this. That's why I called it the hodgepodge stew, Patrick. It's because, when you're making a stew, you're putting stuff in there and you're thinking, I don't know how this is all going to come together. But at the end, if you've done your job right, you just have this beautiful meal and everything aligns. But when you're kind of preparing it, it's kind of a little messy. And that's what some of this data is kind of looking like, Patrick, is it's coming from left field in many different ways. And it's our job here in Rein It In on this show is to kind of create a narrative with this and help investors see the world a certain way in terms of how they can participate in this real estate market. And that's very different, Patrick, because the average homeowner that just wants to have a home, to live in a home, I got it. That's great. This show's not for you. This show's for investors that want to be rental housing providers, and they want to kind of take control of their financial future, help the housing crisis we have here in Canada by providing rental housing to everyone. And that's what this data is so important, Patrick.
Well, it's interesting too that, when we look at this, and I want to just share this, is that, again, I've said before, I watch a couple of talking heads that are talking about this housing bubble and it's going to crash. And I just listened to one of them the other day that's saying Calgary's so out of sync, people are just being fools. There was one comment he did make that made sense, and he gave it a wrong context, but that was money from Ontario is flooding into the Calgary condo market. And yes, I agree with him in that point. There's going to be some pain in the upcoming years with Ontario investors who are flooding into the condo market in Calgary. It doesn't work that way. Everybody's trying to make Toronto make sense in Calgary. They're two different markets. I've said it 100 times. There, I agree with him. But
but you're. I mean, Patrick, listen. You're Mr. Alberta. You're single-handedly responsible for Ontario money moving into Alberta. You put Alberta on the map, but you have said from day one to stay away from the condo market. I got to give you props on that one.
Yeah, it's still a dangerous market, but you know what? He's having these conversations. Well, prices are ridiculous. Okay, price to income, all wrong. And I'm going, who cares? Like, we can't make that market wrong. What is job growth growing? What and how strong is the economy? It's strong. How diversified has that economy become? Way more diversified. So when we look at the kind of economic fundamentals that drive real estate, none of that is discussed in the retail market for home buyers. They're only looking at how much does a house cost? That's it. And will it go up? No, it's got to come down. It's going to be a bubble. Average incomes are the highest in the country. Job rates are very, very strong, and the economy remains very strong. Infrastructure in Calgary remains very strong.
Patrick, this economic hodgepodge segment is turning into another Alberta, Mr. Alberta segment. I purposely didn't have a Mr. Alberta segment.
Okay, fine. Okay, I'll quit talking now.
So why? But I think it lends itself this way, which is, why are people heading to Alberta? You can see it right in this chart, Patrick, which is people are searching for affordability, and Alberta has it. And that's what you're saying is a lot of these talking heads are saying that pricing is out of control in Alberta. It is still one of the most affordable markets in the entire country by far.
And it's not just affordable housing. It is affordable everything. Gas prices are lower. Food prices are lower. There is no
You
HST.
just
They've
can't
got
help
strong
yourself.
leadership.
You just can't help yourself, Mr. Alberta. You just can't help yourself.
It doesn't matter. If it was Ontario, I'd say Ontario. Right now, in the cycle, Ontario's in a different cycle. It's in a different mode. And so when we look at what's happening in terms of affordability, JG, and what's happening in Alberta, it happens to be the go-to province. So what do we have to consider as investors? We want to put our money to work. We want to know that it has a future, an economic future, not just living on an economic past. And that's why real estate works in Alberta. And it's also the cost of living. So when we talk about affordable housing, we have to also look at affordable cost of living. And that's why people are moving there.
And finally, they got good politics in Alberta. You forgot to mention that.
Very good politics. And by the way, jobs. People are moving there because they can go to work.
So what's interesting with this graph, now that Patrick's done with his promotion of Alberta again, is that the search for affordable housing and the net interprovincial migration chart you can see here completely just perfectly overlays with what we're seeing in terms of people leaving provinces like Ontario. And by the way, there's the reason for that is because a lot of immigrants come and they land in Ontario and then they go elsewhere in the country. That's a big reason, by the way, why Patrick, the numbers are so negative in Ontario. And I got a little something about Ontario that I'm going to share with you in a minute, since you're Mr. Alberta. So I'm going to have to play the other side of this coin.
But hold on, JG. I want to interrupt just so people are really clear. As much as you see that chart in Ontario and other provinces of interprovincial migration, people leaving, it's not in any way, shape, or form saying that it's a negative growth in those provinces. It's just the number of people that are leaving has really gotten high, but still very, very strong population growth in Ontario in this case specifically.
But
So
part of the reason why it's high is because the number coming into Ontario is higher than it's ever been because of the overall immigration in the country.
Yeah.
So once they get here, then they go out to other provinces a year later, 2 years later, 6 months later, whatever the case may be. So that plays a role in it. Just so everyone understands the charts, right, Patrick?
yes, exactly.
Speaking of population growth, Patrick, let's have a quick peek at this amazing chart on the growth in non-permanent residents. This is a 4-quarter rolling total. Man, this chart just shows the growth. It's astronomical. And what I really like is just this chart goes really far back to 1975. And I also like to see, just again, to understand the data, I like to see the negative periods. You can see there's a period there between the early 1990s to the early 2000s. It was negative. The non-permanent residents were not coming in. It was negative.
Yeah, so exactly. So we start to see just how dramatic this shift has been for this country, and of course, all of the challenges that comes with it. We were just talking about net interprovincial migration, and aside from affordability, JG, is that finding a place to live. So that immigration that's coming into the country, number one, they got to go to work. And secondly, they have to have a place to live. And then when you look at some areas in Toronto, or I don't want to say in Toronto, in Ontario, like Toronto, there's just a lack of places to live, number one. Number two is the affordability side of it. So we got all of these people coming into this country, which are non-permanent at this point. But here's the truth for it. If for us as investors, we're looking at it, we want to be the rental housing providers for that cohort, for that immigration.
So give us this chart here, Patrick. We're looking at actually Canada versus BC, Alberta, Ontario, Quebec, as it relates to sales, new listings, active inventory, and house prices. And you can see, as we always say, real estate is regional. It's not even provincial, by the way. It goes way more detailed than that. But in this show, we'll cover some regionality of the provinces. Interesting how this chart is showing the different provinces and how they operate.
Well, I think there's no surprises when you look at this chart and you start to look at what's happening in Ontario. It is really the most expensive market. And I realize that there's a qualifier with what's happening in some parts of British Columbia, specifically Vancouver. But when you look at what's happening in Ontario and the slowdown and some of the sales coming off in terms of prices, it's not really surprising given it was the highest growth market. And a lot of that goes back to what we were just talking about, which is population growth. So now all of a sudden that market that was driving up, we've got a whole different set of issues. And there's so many little things that are really impacting this market in terms of a slowdown of sales, slowdown of prices, not the least of which is what was happening in the pre-built kind of space, not just condos, but even homes where people well, I say they ordered, but they bought houses to be built, and now they're coming due. And guess what? The houses aren't worth what they were when they bought them. Interest rates have, tripled and quadrupled given what they thought they were going to pay for an interest rate. People are actually walking away. So sales and everything is a real mess in parts of Ontario. And a lot of that has to do with the pre-built market, especially in the condo market. And a lot of the buying that was going on was in the anticipation of assigning those deals, as we know. A lot of that is just coming off the rails. So given the size of that Ontario market, given what was happening back in 2021, 2022, it's not surprising that this has come off, but it's really showing up in big numbers.
Now, here's another chart, Patrick, on the 3-month change in house prices. Again, you can see the different regions there. Now, for people watching this show, if you want to really get up to the minute or up to the hour, I should say, data, then you should go to di-vault.com, di-vault.com, and get access to that artificially intelligent platform, which actually the data there is updated every single hour. And this is a good indication, Patrick, of this is July through October data, which is just coming to fruition now. That's 8 weeks old, Patrick. This data is almost, 4 weeks old. This data is a month old and it's just starting now to get people that use platforms like DI Vault, and I highly recommend DI Vault. That's the one I use. That's the one Patrick uses. We have up to the hour pricing. I had this data, from July all the way to October. I didn't have to wait a month for this to come out.
Well, we got to embrace technology, that's for sure. That's coming at us. We may as well get ahead of that wave, which is happening in terms of technology. As investors, it's our job. It really owe it to ourselves and our portfolios to stay ahead and get the most up-to-date data so that we can make decisions. And this is what's happening right now, JG. And again, as we look across the market, you and I are seeing it, the uncertainty and what's happening in the housing market. If you're a retail buyer, it's a problem. And you can really have some sleepless nights. If you're an investor that they're seeing opportunities, there's lots of opportunities to be had. And, these are just what happens in these kind of economic conditions. So this is an interesting chart, JG, that we have to at least be aware of. And that is, the good news is that there is a lot more rental inventory coming on, and it's starting to build. So that's good news. Some are concerned. Some would actually say that we got to pay attention to this, because if at some point immigration rolls back, we could in fact have overbuilt conditions. It's interesting about this is that I've talked about it in the past, is that's what happened in Edmonton back in, I think, about 2005, 2006, big boom of economically, a lot of people moving into the city. Everybody got on the condo bandwagon and was building condos, and they overbuilt. Well, they had huge projects being built, and that then fell flat. So what do they do with all those condos? They turned them into rental units. It's all to say this, is that there is some fear of that happening in different regions, that now they've got all of these rental units coming on board. But I think given just the sheer volume of people moving into this country, they're never going to keep up in that regard on the rental side of things. But I think it's something to pay attention to in specific cities.
I totally agree, Patrick. Definitely something to keep an eye on. And if you see the immigration trends reverse, definitely I would start asking myself those questions, because this is something that's actually not very prominent. Doesn't happen very often in Canada because we're so bureaucratically tied to and just locked, the permits are so difficult to get that it's hard for us to overbuild here in Canada. But in the States, it's very different. And the US goes through these kinds of things all the time. The reason for that is because they build a lot faster than we do in the States, and they often get in an overbuilt situation. And you saw that in the great financial crisis. That was fueled by the subprime crisis, but it was also fueled by new construction. And it's not the first time that happened to the States. That's happened quite a few times. Not as often in Canada, but it's definitely something I keep a close eye on, Patrick.
Well, there's another side to this, JG, which is that as much as we've got immigration coming into the country, we've got rental units that are going up. Good news. There is the reality of the affordability. And unless interest rates come back down, unless we can get single family building happening, unless we can start to supply those first time and next time home buyers, ultimately rental demand is going to stay high. Not just immigration, but for those who can't afford to buy a home, there's going to be those challenges. So they're going to be renting as well. So we're getting rental demand from different directions. And then to some, arguably, I guess there is certainly a cohort of millennials or whatever cohort that is that are going, no, I don't want to own, I don't want to have the debt, I don't even want to have a car. So these are things that are shifting in, I guess, who we are societal as a country is, what are people doing in terms of what they want. So demand, I think rental demand, this is a low risk thing, but it's in specific cities you have to pay attention to it.
If you like what you learned here, go to the description below and subscribe for our free Insiders newsletter, where you can also stay up to date for our upcoming events and our courses.
If you want to see more stuff like this, click here. If you want to see the entire show, click there.